Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 14th of April of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Moscow. As we know, the Russian offensive operation is gaining momentum. The Russians are advancing along the entire line of combat contact, and today we got a very interesting article about the situation with the Russian resources, mobilization resources. The Russian army is replenished by more than 1,000 people every day, a German analyst. Russians have become more active in joining the Russian armed forces due to high bonuses and the expectation of a quick end to the Ukrainian conflict, writes Denis Kluch, deputy head of the department at the German Institute for International and Foreign Affairs. My database of 37 Russian regions seems to confirm this, he wrote. He collected data from open source on 37 regions and extrapolated it to the entire Russian territory. His graph shows that the Russian army is replenished by 1,000 and 1,200 people every day, more than 30,000 per month. So we see that Russians have no problems with this, but I'll remind you that several weeks ago Zelensky adopted a law that allow the Ukrainians to sign contracts with 18th or 25th years old boys. But according to information we have, since this procedure started, just 500 people signed this contract since the beginning for several weeks and for dozens of days. But when talking about the Russians, every single day 1,000 soldiers signed such a contract. So we see that the Russians are highly motivated, and obviously they continue concentration of their forces for something bigger than we can see right now along the entire line of combat contact. Very interesting update is coming from Germany. Friedrich Merz, who is set to take office as the Chancellor of Germany next month, stated that Germany is willing to send Taurus long-range cruise missiles to Ukraine as long as it is jointly agreed with Germany's European partners. He also condemned the Russian Iskander-M ballistic missile strike on Sumy as a serious war crime and said that Ukraine needs help to get ahead in the conflict. So we see that nobody is going to settle the conflict. We see that we are about to enter another wave of escalation. Now let's continue with the situation on the ground, and probably in this video let's start with the Pokrovsk-Kostyantynivka direction, where according to my understanding of the situation, the general or the major battle of 2025 is going to take place. Let's start from the beginning, and currently let's start with the most important area. We're talking about the Russian offensive operation and the Russian advance to the south of the Kleban-Byk water reservoir. Today we got additional updates, and as for now we see that the Russians are completely focused on the territory of the villages of Valentinovka and Sukhaya Balka. According to information we have, during the previous 48-72 hours the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. So as for now, different sources, reliable sources confirm Russian control over the settlement of Valentinovka. At least 80 or 90% of the village is already under complete Russian control. Furthermore, the pro-Ukrainian sources reported that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to physically cut the road that goes from the, let's say, Konstantinovka, from the mainland, in the direction of the Sukhaya Balka-Valentinovka line. So which means that Ukrainians that are currently located on the territory of these two settlements were caught by the Russians, and now they have no other option but to begin retreating during the upcoming days and upcoming nights. Otherwise they would be caught in cauldron without any possibilities for evacuation, because we expect that during the next several days the Russians will resume their attempts to attack from the settlement of Nelipovka and Leonidovka in the western direction, with the purpose to get as close as possible to the road N20. If the Russians are able to complete this offensive operation, then the Ukrainians would be caught in cauldron without any possibilities for anything. So this is the first target in this tactical offensive operation, to cut these two villages, to destroy and to bypass this let's say dense network of the fortifications, and then to move further in the northwestern directions towards the settlement of Stara Mykolaiv, Ignatovka and Zorya. And this is going to be most likely the second stage of this offensive operation. At the same time, we remember that the Russians are advancing from the south, trying to get as close as possible to Stara Nikolaevka. And furthermore, we remember that the Russians are trying to advance in the direction of Alexandropol and then with the purpose to move further in the eastern directions towards the settlement of Zorya. So, summarizing everything for this tactical offensive operation, the Russians have just one purpose and one goal: to establish complete over everything that is located inside of this red line. We're talking about the settlements of Sherbinovka, Novospaska, Zarya, Romanovka, Alexandropol, Stara Nikolaevka, Sukhaya Balovka. All these villages is the first target of the Russians during this battle, during this general or major battle for the Pokrovsk-Kostyantynivka arc. Furthermore, today the Russians, not just today, but these days, the Russians launched another offensive operation. And as for this offensive operation, we are talking about the line between the settlements of Elizavetovka and Malinovka. This is also a very important part of the front line for the Russians. I'll remind you that just yesterday, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes, the group of forces center managed to establish complete control over this territory. And the day before this event, the Russians established complete control over the territory in the vicinity of Novospaska. As for this video that was published by the 46th Air Mobile Brigade, the most important probably this part, because in this part we can see up to 10 vehicles or even more vehicles of the armored force of the Russian Federation that were involved in that offensive operation, and we can see the significant number of infantry that the Russians managed to land exactly in this area and that began advancing further in the northern direction. This part is very important for the Russians, and we believe that the main purpose of the Russians is to establish complete control over these territories. If the Russians are able to do this, then we see that the city, not just the city, but the city of Pokrovsk, the agglomeration of Pokrovsk, where the towns like Mirnograd and Novoekonomichna would be caught in pincers from the east and from the west. And this is obviously not the beginning of assault operations towards the city of Pokrovsk. We don't think that the Russians are going to do this. This is something like a plan B. If the Ukrainians are able to stabilize the situation, only then the Russians will try to assault the city of Pokrovsk. As for now, the Russians will try to take the settlement in Kodrum by taking under control first the main supply roads, and then the Russians will just try to force the Ukrainians to fall back, probably without even clashes, serious clashes for the city itself. So we believe that the Russians are trying to do something as they managed to create or to make on the territory of the settlement by the name of Selidova. I'll remind you, the city of Selidova was abandoned by the Ukrainians without clashes. So the city was completely undamaged as a result of clashes, and now the Russians most likely are planning to do the same with the city of Pokrovsk, because this is very important logistic hub. Obviously, the Russians want civilians to return back to the settlement and to continue living there and building their lives on the territory of this settlement. So for these purposes, they need to save the settlement as much as possible. Now let's return back, of course, and let's continue with the situation in the Kleban-Byk water reservoir direction. The Russians are currently, there are still very heavy clashes between the city of Toretsk and the city of Konstantinovka. I'll remind you that several days ago the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt and to take under control the village of Nilipovka and this stronghold, and now the Russians are trying to hold their positions in this area. The Ukrainians are trying to counterattack this territory every single day with the purpose to restore control over the lost territories, but according to geolocations we receive, we see that Ukrainians can't do anything with this. The only thing the Ukrainians are doing, they're losing vehicles and equipments during their counterattacks. Furthermore, we understand that the Ukrainians that are currently located on the territory of this mine are in a big trouble. The Russians managed to block them, and currently this is already third or fourth day without any supply from the mainland. I believe that Ukrainians still have possibilities to get water, food, ammo, arms using drones, but obviously you don't have thousands of drones that can, let's say, support the contingent of the armored forces of Ukraine on the territory of these facilities. So that is why we start receiving lots of updates from the territory in the northern part of the settlement by the name of Sherbinovka. More precisely, the Russians began bombing and attacking the concentrations of Ukrainian forces in this area, the Ukrainian vehicles and the Ukrainian positions, which means that currently the Ukrainians are trying to concentrate their forces in this area with the purpose to carry out or to conduct offensive, counter-offensive operation in the direction of the northwestern part of the city of Toretsk, with the purpose to unblock the Ukrainian units in the mine and either to restore control over the front line or to create or maintain a corridor for evacuation. So something like this is happening right now. We see lots of videos. For example, in this video we can see that the Russians managed to establish mines along the main supply line through the village through the river of Mokry Toretsk, and the Ukrainians got on these mines and were damaged and destroyed. In this video we can see how the Russians managed to discover the equipment of the Western production. Most likely the Ukrainians arrived to this point, landed infantry and joined, for example, another group of Ukrainian forces that is being prepared before the further counter-offensive operation. The Russian drone was flying above this territory trying to find the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine, but after the Russians didn't manage to find anything, they attacked and destroyed this vehicle. And for example, in this video we can see how the Russians attack Ukraine vehicle that was most likely returning back from the northwestern part of the city of Toretsk. So we see that, so we got lots of icons from this area, and we believe that we are going to receive more and more icons during the next 2-3 days, and then the Ukrainians will begin their counter-attack. This is very important question for them, because if the Russians are able to repel these upcoming counter-attacks, the Ukrainians from the territory of mine are doomed. Now let's move further. At the same time, the Russians, while the Ukrainians are focused and while the Ukrainians are concentrated on the operation in this area, the armed forces of the Russian Federation are trying to advance along 0519 road in the direction of the settlement by the name of Delivka. And during the previous 24 hours, we got another video published by the Russian side where we can see another convoy of the armed forces of the Russian Federation with one tank with clearing equipment and 2 infantry fighting vehicles with troops on board. We're counter-attacking, we're attacking the Ukrainian positions along the 3 lines in this pocket, and most likely the Russians managed to improve their position there. Furthermore, the Russians established complete FPV drone control over the northern part of the settlement of Delivka with the purpose not to allow the Ukrainians to redeploy additional reinforcements and reserves with the purpose to stabilize the situation. So we expect as for this direction, the Russians will try to cut this pocket with these fields as well in the very near future. So we are entering the most decisive part of the battle for the Konstantinovka and Pokrovsk arc. As for the Konstantinovka or the Chasiv Yar direction, during the previous 24 hours we haven't received anything special, just the regular activities of both the Russians and the Ukrainians. We continue receiving more and more videos from the settlement of Konstantinovka itself. In this video we can see how the Russians, as a result of FPV drone managed to destroy another vehicle of the armored forces of Ukraine on the territory of the settlement. So most likely during the next days we're going to receive more and more videos exactly from this city. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Sivas direction where the Russians continue their offensive operation as well. There are still very heavy clashes for the settlement of Verkhnykamenska. Of course, the village of Verkhnykamenska is the shortest way for the armored force of the Russian Federation to attack the city of Sivas from the east. The Ukrainians understand this, so that is why this stronghold is really reinforced by the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians are not counting losses with the purpose to hold their positions on the territory of these ruins, not even the settlement itself. The Russians understand this as well, of course. Every single time they try to test the Ukrainian defense, trying to find the moment when the Ukrainians are going to be the weakest and to attack them, but as for now we see without any progress on the ground. At the same time, the Russians are trying to develop another roads of attack with the purpose to outflank the city of Sivers. This is not the shortest way, but obviously this is much more easier way in comparison with the movements through the village of Verkhnykamenska. During the previous 24 hours, we got this video that was published by the Ukrainians. In this video, we can see how the Ukrainians of the 81st Mobile Brigade were counter-attacking the Russians in this area, and as a result of this counter-offensive operation, most likely the Ukrainians managed to restore control over the positions they lost during the previous Russian offensive operation. Based on this video, we made 2 adjustments on map. Some territories were colored in the Ukrainian favor, some territories were colored in the Russian favor. So for example, this is the situation by the end of the 30th of April of 2025, and this is the situation by the end of the 14th of April of 2025. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Lyman direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation as well. Currently, there are very heavy clashes on the territory of the settlement of Tarskoye. As for the end of the 14th of April of 2025, the main territories, the main number of territories, fields, fortifications and strongholds in this area were already colored by the Ukrainians as a contested area. As you can see, there are huge territories that are colored by the pro-Ukrainian sources as a contested area or the gray zones. But when talking about the Russian resources, we can see that they show completely different situation. According to pro-Russian resources, by the end of the 14th of April, the Russians controlled up to 50 or 60% of the settlement of Tarskoye. By the way, today we got a very important video, this one, where we can see how the Russians were FPV droning the Ukrainian vehicles on the territory of the settlement, which means that the central part is still under complete Ukrainian control, despite the fact that Ukrainians were trying to evacuate their servicemen. We're not saying that something is unpredictable here or something like this. We're just trying to tell you that most likely there are still very heavy clashes, most likely that Ukrainians still have possibilities to bring additional forces to the territory of the village of Tarskoye, and despite the fact that the days of this village are numbered, currently it's very difficult to say whether we are talking about 5, 10 or 20 days of battle for the settlement. But obviously let's say the days of this village are very short. Furthermore, the Russians continue their offensive operation, and we continue receiving more and more updates of Russian strikes in the vicinity of the city by the name of Lyman. In this video, we can see how the Russians discovered the positions of the FPV drone operators of the armored forces of Ukraine, and then the Russians attacked this territory with Ilmur missile. So we see that the Russians control the situation. The Russians have lots of drones flying above this territory, trying to get and to find as many as possible positions of Ukraine FPV drone operators. At the same time, the Russians continue advancing in the Borova direction, and today we added additional changes on the ground according to pro-Russian resources. This morning, the pro-Russian resources began publishing information that as a result of offensive operation, the Russians entered the village of Novy Mikhailovka. Later, we got this, let's say, map update, and according to pro-Russian resources, this is something that the Russians managed to establish control over during the previous 24 hours. So we see that the Ukrainian defense in the northern arc, in the northern axis of this area, collapsed completely. We expect that during the next probably 100 hours, the Russians will secure this territory completely. Furthermore, the Russians continue bombing and attacking the positions of FPV drone operators in the vicinity of this Russian breakthrough. Now let's move further. As for the northern direction, the Russians during the previous 24 hours were trying to attack the Ukrainian positions and to break through the Ukrainian defense belt with the purpose to attack the settlement of Borova itself. But this attack carried out by the Russians was repelled by the Ukrainians by the 77th Air Mobile Brigade. In this video, we can see lots of vehicles that the Russians were trying to use for this counter-offensive operation, but most of those vehicles were attacked, were destroyed, damaged, and destroyed by the Ukrainians. So we see that this area is also one of the most important directions for the armored force of the Russian Federation. As for the Kupiansk direction, during the previous 24 hours, we have several updates. The Russians advanced a bit in the fields from the area of Orlovka towards the settlement of Petropavlovka, and the Russians, according to pro-Russian resources, managed to discover the positions of the 116th Mechanized Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine, and as a result of multiple Iskander strikes, this temporary deployment point of this unit was damaged and destroyed in the northern part of the city of Kupiansk. Now let's move further. As for the northern directions, Sumy and Belgorod direction, during the previous 24 hours we haven't received anything special. Once again, I'll remind you that the Russians improved their positions in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Garnal, and according to different sources, up to 300 soldiers were encircled by the Russians on the territory of this church, and currently there are very heavy clashes for this territory. The Russian sources reported that the Russians began the decisive assault operation with the purpose to force the Ukrainians to fall back from this area and to save as much as possible this church complex. But something tells me that this church complex would be reduced to ruins, because 300 of Ukrainian soldiers, it's too much. It's too much, obviously. Now let's go a bit back to the south in the direction of the city of Pokrovsk to the western flank, where the Russians also continue their offensive operation. According to information we have, the Russians managed to stabilize the situation in the, let's say, salient between the settlement of Uspenovka, Udachная, Kotlina, Peshchana completely. The Ukrainians suffered losses during their attempts to counter-attacks in February and March of 2025, and now the Russians slowly but step by step began offensive with the purpose to first of all restore control over the territories they lost during the Ukraine counter-attacks, and then to move even further. So we have geolocations that confirm Russian strong control over the settlement of Kotlina. All Ukrainian attacks were repelled. Furthermore, we have map update from pro-Ukrainian sources regarding the southeastern part of the settlement of Udachная. Based on this video, let's say article, we have adjusted the map back in the Russian favor, and we continue receiving updates of Russian offensive operation on the line between the Novopavlovka and the settlement of Shevchenka. Right before we start making this video, we got lots of updates and lots of geolocations from the settlement of Shevchenka itself. There are lots of geolocations. We still haven't managed to geolocate most of them, but before the next video probably we will do this and we will adjust the map. And summarizing everything, by the end of the 14th of April we start receiving first reports that the Russians established control for over more than 30% of this settlement, and the Russians continue advancing. So maybe tomorrow in the morning the Russians will establish complete control over this territory, and the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm this. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.